All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to week number 8 of our series, our verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of John. Let's remind ourselves, just because I like to remind you each week, so by the end of this series, you'll have this down in your mind firmly. Gospel is a genre. It's an ancient Greek genre, a type of literature. It was originally, the word gospel, it means a proclamation, a good news. And it was something that the emperor would give to announce the birth of a child or the winning of a war or something. It also then began to mean an ancient first century Greco-Roman biography combined with a first century preaching. So it was this hybrid of a genre, literary genre. And that's what it's known by today. A gospel is exclusively one of the 4 presentations, biographies of the life of Jesus from the first century. The author, it's not known absolutely certain who the author is. There's pretty good consensus. It's either John, son of Zebedee, who was one of the 12 disciples, who also wrote the book of Revelation, or it was the elder of John the elder, who was as well a follower of Jesus and was quite well known in the Jerusalem area. Some scholars think it could have been that individual as well, a well-respected follower of Jesus named John. We're going with John, son of Zebedee. I think there's good, solid evidence for that. It was written probably, again, we don't know for sure, there's no dates on it, but probably sometime between 70, 85 AD. So after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, John was the apostle who lived the longest, and so this was the last of the 4 Gospels that were written. Now remember, we began with what was called the prologue, and the prologue gives the reader inside information about the theme and about the individual about whom this is being written. So through the prologue, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. That's all part of the prologue, the first chapter essentially, the beginning of the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And it gives you as a reader some insight into this is who we're talking about. This is what happened. We're letting you know that God took on flesh, and here's what happened when God took on flesh. And I'm writing this so that you will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's what the beginning of the gospel is all about. And what we've just done now is we've completed the first portion of John's gospel, which was the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And we saw, we're now moving into the next major phase of the Gospel of John, which is what we'll call the confession of the Son of God. Meaning, as Jesus is growing in notoriety, as he's growing in popularity, he's having to explain himself more and more. He's having to answer the question essentially, so who are you? Who do you think you are? Where are you getting the authority to say and do these things? And that's what we're moving into now as we go to John chapter 5 in John's Gospel. So up until this point, Jesus has been primarily interacting with individuals. But from this point onwards in John's Gospel, he begins to engage with groups of people, both groups of supporters and groups of dissenters. And so during the next few chapters, John records the shift from reservation and hesitation about Jesus to outright, sometimes official opposition to Jesus. We'll see the shifts take place in the next few chapters. And so we begin with John chapter 5, and it's the healing of the lame man on the Sabbath. So as your outline says, number 1, John sets the scene. Here John sets the scene in his gospel. Let's read verses 1 to 5 from John chapter 5. Now, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now, there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. And one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. Now let's pause here for a second. As your outline says, so this event takes place during an unnamed Jewish festival. We don't know what festival it was. It's unnamed, but it's during a Jewish festival. And B, the event takes place at a popular public gathering place. So it takes place at a popular public gathering place. every tour I take to Israel, I take people to this place. This is known today. It's an archaeological site, the Pool of Bethesda. And you can look down into where the pool was. An ancient church was built over it over the years and so on, but it's there. And it was quite a famous place during that time. As your outline says, letter C, due to a long-standing legend, the place was frequented by many disabled. So due to a long-standing legend, many disabled people gathered here. Now, some manuscripts, some ancient manuscripts, apparently not the best ones, that's why it's not included in most Bibles today, but some manuscripts include the legend. So some ancient manuscripts kind of inserted the legend into it. So some manuscripts add, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir the waters, and the first one into the pool after each disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. So now we realize today that there was a spring that fed it from the bottom, so every so often the water would stir. And the legend was that was an angel stirring the water. And the first one in, after the water got stirred, would get cured. And so it drew all sorts of people to this pool, particularly folks who were battling various diseases. Now, understanding this legend is essential to understanding the context and the meaning behind the lame man's response to Jesus in verse 7, which we'll get to in a moment. So, letter D in your outline, the lame man is introduced in verse 5. The lame individual is introduced. Now, the length of this man's illness is seen as significant to John. 38 years this gentleman had been struggling with this disability. And so, number 2 on your outline, Jesus arrives on the scene. Jesus arrives on the scene. Let's read verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, so he asked the man, "Do you want to get well?" So, letter A, Jesus focuses upon this particular individual amongst a crowd. He focuses upon this particular individual amongst a crowd. So notice it says Jesus saw him and Jesus learned. So either Jesus asked about this man or he was told about this man. Okay? Now the implication here is important, and it's something that people rarely see. But the implication is that there were many other disabled people at this place, a great number of disabled people, it says, that Jesus did not heal. Have you ever thought about that? There's a great many people that he didn't heal. It was crowded, a great number of people were there, and Jesus healed this. All that's reported is Jesus healed this one man. And then he left through the crowd, we read later. Now, it's also, keep your finger there in John and turn right to Acts chapter 3. There's another individual that people rarely think about, but Acts chapter 3, this is the famous healing of where Peter heals a lame beggar by the gate Beautiful in the temple. It says in Acts 3:1, one day Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 p.m. Now a man who was lame from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful. Remember, we learned about that a few weeks ago. That was the entrance from to the women's court, from the court of the Gentiles. That's where everybody would go through that gate. That's why the gentleman's there begging, because everybody would have to go through this gate. Where he was put every day to beg from those who were going into the temple courts. Now, slip down to verse 9 of Acts 3. When all the people saw him walking and praising God, so this man gets healed. When everybody saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the same man who used to sit begging at the temple gate called Beautiful. And they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. You say, well, Darren, why are you reading this? Jesus walked by that gate for 3 years. This guy was so well known because he'd been sitting there for years. So why didn't Jesus heal him? So we have this in our mind that Jesus healed everybody that he saw. That's not true. And here's an example here, the one that we're dealing with in the Gospel of John, even when you look at Acts. So sometimes we're imagining things happening that Scripture actually doesn't say was happening. Okay? Jesus healed everybody that he wanted to heal. But that doesn't mean he healed everyone. The implication is there were many other lame people by this pool that Jesus walked by and did not heal them. All right. Letter B, it says there in your outline, Jesus asked this man a provocative question. He asked this man a provocative question. I call it the rudest question in the Bible, the strangest question in the Bible. That guy has been battling this condition for 38 years. He's been sitting by this pool for who knows how long. And Jesus walks up to him and says, so do you want to be healed? It's like, what? Seriously? That would anger me almost. In fact, you wonder about this guy if he was angered by that. You'll see here what I'm getting at in a moment, because we're going to do a little bit of a character study on this guy. And I'm not too impressed with this guy the more I read about him. But let's keep going. Number 3 in your outline. The lame man gives Jesus his answer. So Jesus says, do you want to be well? And the lame man gives Jesus his answer. We read it in verse 7. It says, sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. So now we know the context, right? The legend was, first one in when the water gets stirred. He said, somebody always gets in front of me. Now, personally, if that's me, and I believe this legend, I'm laying right on the edge of that pool. And as soon as there's even a gust of wind, I'm falling in every time. But this guy, no, it's always somebody else's fault. So, as your outline says, 3a, he believed and blamed the superstition. So this man believed and he blamed the superstition. Now, when we pull together the threads of information we have about this gentleman, we get a sense of his character. Now, as we're going to read in a moment, Jesus heals this man. And this infuriates the Jewish leaders because this is taking place on the Sabbath, which we'll get to in a moment as well. But Jesus heals the man, tells him to get up, pick up his mat that he'd been laying on for a long time, and tells him to walk. When the Jewish leaders didn't like that at all, carrying your mat on the Sabbath, unheard of. So they point out to the man that in their opinion, he's breaking the law. Okay? And now how this man responds reveals a lot about him. Skip forward to verse 11, because this is where we'll do a bit of a character study, and we'll come back to verse 8 and 9 in a moment, but skip ahead to verse 11. It says, so the Jewish leaders are asking him, what's going on here? How come you're picking up your mat, you're walking? Who told you to do this? And he replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. So first of all, what we see here is he avoids conflict by blaming the healer. He avoids conflict by blaming the healer. We're learning about his character here. He believed and blamed the superstition. Secondly, he avoids conflict by blaming the healer. Now, is that how you would have responded? You know, well, it wasn't me. The guy who healed me, he's the one who told me to do this. It's like he's throwing the person who healed him under the bus. Not my fault, don't blame me. I've just been supernaturally healed. But you're angry because I'm walking and picking up my mat. But the guy who healed me, it's his fault. Blame him. Okay? And also, letter C, he doesn't bother to discover the name of his healer. He doesn't know who healed him. I mean, he knows him to see him, but he doesn't know his name. Again, wouldn't you ask around a bit? Or wouldn't your first thing be, wow, who are you? Thank you for this. This is incredible. Who was that guy? But he doesn't know the name. Now, maybe he was too excited. Maybe there's a frenzy in the crowd. We're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. At least we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt for another couple verses. And then when we read what happens when Jesus sees and chats with the man at the temple later, we might change our minds. So how does the man respond after meeting? He meets Jesus at the temple later. Jesus has a conversation with him. And how does the man respond afterwards? Well, read verse 15 of chapter 5. Verse 15, the man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So as your outline says, when he learns the name, he reports him to the authorities. So they had said to him before, who is this person who told you to pick up your mat? I don't know who it was, the guy who healed me. Later, he finds the name of the guy who heals him, and the first thing he does, runs to the authorities. Remember you asked me? His name's Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth. What? Why would he respond that way? I don't know. I'm just saying when I list these things together, I'm thinking, I'm not sure I want to be friends with this guy. Okay? All right, so there you go. Just not a glowing picture of this guy's character in my mind, but that's just me. So we've jumped ahead in the story with our character study. Let's go back to verse 8. Remember, verses 1 to 5, John sets the scene of a popular gathering place with disabled people. Verse 6, Jesus sees and learns about a particular lame man. Jesus approaches this gentleman and questions the man. The man blames the superstition and everyone else for his lack of healing. And then verse 8, then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. So as your outline says, Jesus gives a healing command. Jesus gives a healing command. There's no magic water. There's no magic words. Just an authoritative declaration from Jesus. And this was part of the authority that was tied to Jesus' reputation. This is what set him apart from all the other so-called miracle workers and religious leaders. And that is, Jesus, when he did deliverance ministry, when he delivered people from the demonic realm, he didn't use incantations. He didn't use formulas. He just spoke a word. And that's why people would say, what incredible authority. He wouldn't even say in the name of the Father. He would just say, I tell you, do this. It was his own authority that was called upon. And that's what he does here. He just gives a command. The mat, by the way, was a poor man's bed that doubled as a stretcher for this man. That's what his mat would have been. It would have doubled as his stretcher. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 9. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. Now, the day on which this took place was a Sabbath, okay? So, as your outline says, number 5, the healing was immediate. And John informs us it took place on the Sabbath. So the healing was immediate, and John informs us it took place on the Sabbath. So what exactly is the Sabbath? Okay, now, again, put your pen there in John 5 and turn way left to Exodus chapter 31. Exodus 31, to get a sense of the Sabbath. Sabbath is something that confuses a lot of people. So I'm reading Exodus 31, introduction of the Sabbath, starting at verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, say to who? The Israelites, you must observe the Sabbath. This will be a sign between me and you. Who's he talking to? Israelites. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come. So you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. Who's he talking to? Israelites. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites, who's he talking to? The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant, contract. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites. Who? Forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So, who's he speaking to in verse 12? Who's speaking in verse 12? It's the Lord. And to whom is the Lord speaking? To the Israelites through Moses, their representative. So what's being described here in Exodus 31 is a sign of a covenant. It's a sign of a covenant, just like a ring is a sign of a covenant between myself and my wife. This was a sign of a covenant between God and the nation of Israel. Another sign was circumcision. But this was another sign of the covenant, the contract, the agreement God had made between himself and the children of Abraham. Okay? Now, the Israelites were commanded to refrain from work on the seventh day of the week. Well, I haven't filled in the blank yet in the box, so don't worry. The Israelites were commanded to refrain from work on the seventh day of the week. But what is work? Work is never defined. What is work? So the implication, it seems the assumption of Scripture is whatever one does for customary employment. Whatever you do for your employment, whatever that work is to you, that's work. So if you're a professional, if you're a professional ball player, then work for you is playing baseball. But if you're not a professional baseball player, that would be something you could enjoy doing on your Sabbath rest, right? Or think of it this way. Some people say, no, Sabbath shouldn't involve any work like that. It should just be you sitting down and reading. What if you're a professional scholar? Your job is to read and study. That's your work. So you can see, so what is work? It's whatever, the assumption is whatever you do for customary employment. Here's the next blank on your outline in the box. Over the centuries, Jewish teachers expanded on this and created 39 classifications of work. So they expanded on this, and they created 39 different classifications of work, including carrying anything on the Sabbath, including a pen in your pocket to this day. Or, I remember when our oldest child, Patrick, was born. He was born in Toronto at Mount Sinai Hospital in downtown Toronto, which is a Jewish hospital. And I remember going up to visit Jan and my son when he was first born, and there was a Sabbath elevator. I remember thinking, what is a Sabbath elevator? All I know is I go in it and just, the Sabbath elevator stops at every floor. You don't press the button, it automatically stops at every floor. Why? Because pressing a button was called work. See, and to this day, when we go to Israel and stay at some hotels, every hotel we stay at, the one day if we're in that hotel on the Sabbath, you take the Sabbath elevator you don't do anything. You just go in and automatically it stops at every floor. You don't dare. We pressed the button once. My wife pressed the button. And alarm went off. Alarm went off. It was God saying, Gentile, Gentile, evil Jezebel woman. Anyway, so they take this very seriously, okay? But none of that's in the Bible. So why did they do this? Well, the thinking of the ancient Jewish leaders, religious leaders, particularly in the Pharisaic party, was they were trying to, the intention initially I could see was perhaps pure. So if this is the law, and they wanted to protect people from breaking the law. So what they did was, they put a fence around the law. This is a fence. This is Donald Trump's wall here. Now, I'm not making a political statement by that. But they built a fence around the wall of traditions. And then they added another fence around that, even more traditions. None of these are in the law. But so it says, don't do work. Well, we're going to define work is not carrying anything. It's not walking more than such a length or a distance. And all of these traditions, they built up and built up and built up over the centuries. Okay? All with the goal of protecting people so you couldn't even get close to breaking the law. Because you'd have to break all these traditions first, okay? So in reality, though, these fences became added burdens that weighed the people down, made them feel even guiltier, and even led some of them to breaking the law of God at times, as the traditions became more important than the law. If you want to see an example of this, right on your margin there, Matthew 15, 1-9. Matthew 15, 1-9. We won't go into it today, but there's an example where Jesus says, you keep your traditions, but lead the people to break the law. Instead of honoring their father and mother, you've created a tradition about you can say, instead of what I would give my parents, I'm dedicating it to God. Well, you're actually not honoring your parents. You're breaking the law, but you're keeping your traditions. He's saying you've messed things up here. That was Jesus' issue. It was the traditions they were piling on the people. So as your outline says, number 6, this is where the trouble began for Jesus. Okay? Going all back, he told this man to pick up his mat and walk. Well, that's not against the law. It's against the traditions. So in their mind, it's the same thing. It's all the same. It had become in their minds. It all morphed into the same thing. So verse 10. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." Now, up until this point, the religious leaders have no idea that Jesus is involved. They don't know yet. Number 7. Notice where the Jewish authorities placed their focus, though. Notice where the authorities placed their focus. Read verses 11 and 12. This man replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.' So they asked him, 'Who is this fellow who told you to pick up the mat and walk?' Not, 'Who is this incredible individual who miraculously healed you?' No, 'Who told you to pick up your mat and walk?' Look where they're focused. They didn't even want to know who miraculously healed this man. They wanted to know who told you to pick up your mat and walk. They wanted to know who told you to work on the Sabbath, as they defined work. So we see here how their love for the Sabbath was greater than their love for this man. And this is what Jesus was referring to in another instance when he said, hey, man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Okay, read verse 13. The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. So there were so many lame people there that he could slip into this crowd. A crowd that he didn't heal every one of them. That's my point I was trying to make earlier. Okay? So, as your outline says, notice this man doesn't search for Jesus, but it appears that Jesus searches for the man. Number 9, did I do number 8 already? No. Oh, the fact that Jesus could get lost in the crowd speaks to how many disabled were present. The fact that Jesus could get lost in the crowd speaks to the fact that how many disabled were present. Number 9 in your outline, later on, Jesus searched for the man at the temple. So later on, Jesus searches for the man at the temple. We see it in verse 14. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you're well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." Notice, it appears the man didn't search for Jesus. Jesus searched for the man. And as your outline says, 9a, Jesus focuses the man's attention upon the most serious ailment of all, sin. Jesus isn't saying that the reason you were lame previously was because of sin. That's not what he's saying here. But he's simply saying, listen, so you're well again, so stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. So live pure from this moment on. That's what he's saying. Read verse 15. The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So was he offended by Jesus? I don't know. It just seems like an odd response, a thing to do. So as your outline says, number 10, the man reports Jesus' name to the authorities. What was he thinking? I don't know. He clearly had a fear of these authorities, perhaps. I don't know. Then, so speaking of authority, because this is what this is about here, the authority of Jesus then becomes questioned. Read verses 16 and 17 of John 5. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. So the temperature begins to rise up now. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." Jesus pointed out, as your outline says, a truth agreed upon by all. God is continually working. God is continually working. He had rested from creation work, but he's continually working. Okay? God is continually working. But then Jesus took this a step further. As your outline says, Jesus claimed that whatever justifies God's continuous work also justifies his. Whatever justifies the Father's continuous work justifies his. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." Do you hear what Jesus is saying? Well, the Jewish religious leaders certainly did. Read verse 18. For this reason, they tried to all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. As your outline says, number 2, Jesus' use of the term my Father was highly unusual, and it triggered his opponents. His use of the term my Father was highly unusual and triggered his opponents. My Father implied a level of intimacy and equality with God that was unheard of. It's similar to the difference between a Son of God and the Son of God. The sons of God was a common term for angels and even individuals. But Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, not just a Son of God, the Son of God. Jesus responds by raising the level of intimacy and relationship between himself and the Father. Look at verse 19. He's just ratcheting it up verse by verse. Watch this. This is a fascinating escalation here that is often overlooked by people. Jesus gave them this answer. So they're accusing him. You're making yourself equal with God. So does he dial it back? Oh, no, I'm not. Don't misunderstand me. He does the opposite. Jesus gave them this answer. Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. So number 3, the Son's actions are totally dependent upon the Father's direction. The Son's actions are totally dependent on the Father's direction. So Jesus says that he can do whatever the Father does. Imagine if I said this to you. You just need to know, folks, that whatever the Father does, I do too. That's quite a statement. Quite an incredible declaration for someone to make. I tell you, Pastor Darren can do nothing by himself. I only do what I see my Father do. Because whatever the Father does, Pastor Darren does as well. Really? Yes, and I should be paid a lot more money for it. Because whatever the Father does, I do. Right? That's quite an incredible statement to make. But Jesus continues to stir up the crowd with his incredible claims. He ratchets it up. Look at verse 20. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you'll be amazed. Number 4, everything is tied to the Father's love for the Son. Everything is tied to the Father's love for the Son. Jesus is saying, I am uniquely loved by the Father. Interestingly, the word love there, not agape. It's phileo, which is the word for brotherly love, family, brotherly love. Now, keep this in mind. Jesus did not speak this in ancient Greek. Jesus spoke this in Aramaic. And so John, as the editor of this, he chose that word phileo to best represent what Jesus was communicating here, according to John's understanding. So what Jesus is saying here is, I am uniquely loved by the Father, to the point that the Father shows me everything that he does. I have inside information about everything when it comes to God. But it's not just information. Keep reading, verse 20 to 21. For the Father loves the Son, shows him all that he does. Yes, he'll show him even greater things than these, so you're going to be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Number 5, the Son has the power to give life to anyone he chooses. So this is not a matter of just me submitting to the Father and the Spirit of God telling me to raise that person from the dead. Jesus says, no. It's not even that. I can do this to whomever I want. I can give life to whoever I choose. Jesus is claiming to have authority that is identical to the Father. Just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Just like the Father, so the Son. That's incredible. John's claims continue to escalate. Look at verse 22. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. As your outline says, the Father has entrusted all judgment to the Son. Consider what Jesus is claiming here. These religious leaders knew the Scriptures. They were very familiar with the very first book of the Bible, Genesis. Very familiar with who was the judge of all the earth. Very familiar with the words of their father Abraham in Genesis 18 when he was pleading for Sodom. And then he says, surely will not, he's speaking to the Lord, surely the judge of all the earth will do right. They know as Jews that God is the judge of all the earth. And Jesus says, I am the one who judges all the earth. Keep reading verse 23. That all may, this just throws it over the edge, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. In fact, whoever doesn't honor the Son doesn't honor the Father who sent him. As your outline says, this is so all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Either this is true or this is blasphemous madness. Jesus is saying, if you don't honor me, you're not honoring God the Father. So if you dishonor me in any way, you are dishonoring God the Father. You should honor me just like you honor the Father. That's what he's saying. All may honor the Father just as they honor the Son. Whoever doesn't honor me doesn't honor the Father who sent him. And the claims keep coming. Read verse 24 to 25. Very truly I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but has crossed over from death to life. Very truly I tell you, a time is coming, has now come, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. In other words, number 7, the Son's words impart eternal life. My words impart eternal life is what he's saying. And then, number 8, the Son shares the attribute of self-existence. That's really not a really good term. Eternality would be better, but the Son shares the attribute of self-existence with the Father. Look at verse 26. As the Father has life in himself, in other words, the Father doesn't look to anyone else as his source of life. He's eternal. As the Father has life in himself, it says, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. So in other words, your outline says the Son shares the attribute of self-existence with the Father, eternality. So Jesus is claiming to be eternal. Now that word granted used to confuse me for the longest time. Because on one level it looks like Jesus saying, just like the Father is eternal, he's granted the Son to be eternal as well. Well, that's irrational. If it, on its surface, it's like me saying, he's saying, you can't grant eternality to someone. Because if you're granting it to them, that means you're giving them eternality, but you can't give eternality. Eternality means you have no beginning and no end. But if I'm giving you eternality, it means that from now on you'll be eternal. So you do have a beginning. You're not eternal. You're immortal. You're not eternal. You see, so it can't be that the Father said, okay, I'm going to create the Son and I'm going to give him the attribute of being eternal. That's irrational. So what's being said here, it appears, is the Father has decreed that the one who comes to earth on the Father's behalf will also be eternal. In other words, it's a breadcrumb that's being laid down again. It's a clue as to the true nature of the Son. The Father has decreed in eternity past that the one who comes to earth will also be eternal. The Son of God will be eternal. Well, there's only one being that's eternal. So again, it's a breadcrumb. It's a clue that they pick up later. Keep reading verse 27. And he has given him, the Son, authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. So as your outline says, the Son of God is also known as the Son of Man. Now, what's this? Let's remind ourselves. We did a teaching on this a while ago in this class, but turn back to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7, in Daniel's vision, starting at 7:13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, that's God, that's the Father on the throne, and was led into his presence. He, the Son of Man, was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. Well, that's blasphemous if it's not God. His dominion is an everlasting dominion and will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now, this confused Jewish scholars for the longest time. But out of it, and look this up on your own sometimes, it's a fascinating study called The Two Powers in Heaven. It was a Jewish doctrine of the two powers that flowed out of this and some other passages in Exodus of the angel of the Lord and so on. This two powers in heaven doctrine started to grow in Judaism. In fact, it was called binitarian. Just like we are called Trinitarians, binitarian means two. And so there's this teaching that was growing from 200 BC on of the two powers. It was believed and accepted as part of Jewish doctrine until the 2nd century, that there was this mysterious binitarian nature to Yahweh, that there was an invisible spirit and a visible, often in human form, version of Yahweh, that they couldn't quite understand. They're still monotheists, but there was a binitarianism that was growing and being understood and was taught as accepted Jewish doctrine until the early 2nd century. So 100 years after Christ's death and resurrection, where it suddenly began to be labeled as blasphemous. Why? Because of the response of Christianity and them linking Jesus to the Daniel passage. And so they said, well, we can't have that. So they shut it down, and it was blasphemous from that point on. Fascinating. But Jesus chose the title Son of Man to describe himself because it was sort of an under-the-radar description of God, of Yahweh. So we said before, don't think Son of God means his divinity and Son of Man his humanity. No, Son of Man was a divine title from this figure in Daniel chapter 7. Okay, keep reading verses 28 and 29. We're almost done. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out, and those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. So as your outline says, the voice of the Son will set off the final resurrection of the dead. The voice of the Son will set off the final resurrection of the dead. Is Jesus teaching that one can work their way into God's presence? 10a, Jesus himself defines what done what is good means. Jesus himself defines this. Read John 6, 28, 29. Let's read that, just the next page. John 6, 28, 29. They asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, believe in the one he has sent. That's the work he's talking about. All right, verse 30. By myself I can do nothing. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just, for I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. So as your outline says, number 11, the Son's dependence upon the Father ensures the justice of his judgments. His dependence on the Father ensures the judgment of his judgments, the justness. When you pull all this together, you see the tension that exists within the incarnation. The Son is equal to the Father. Yet while he was on earth, the Son willingly chose to submit himself to the Father. Many people cherry pick the verse where Jesus says, the Father is greater than I. Well, they ignore the entire context of these statements. When they'll say Jesus, many Muslims will say this, Jesus said the Father is greater than I. That means the Father's better than him, right? A higher quality being. No. The Prime Minister is greater than I in authority. And I submit to the Prime Minister. Yeah. Siri disagreed with that, by the way. So I submit to the authority of the Prime Minister. Does that mean the Prime Minister is better than you and better than me? No. But it's a willful submission that we do. We submit to the authority. When you submit to a police officer, when the lights flash and you pull your vehicle over, are you doing that because that police officer is better than you? No. You are submitting to the governing authorities. You are choosing to do this. In the same way that Jesus says, when he walked the earth, the Son, during those 33 years on earth, he submitted to the will of the Father. I only do what I see the Father do. The Father's greater than I. I've submitted. It's not saying the Father's better, Because we read later how that he'll be returned to his former glory, and he'll receive all the glory that he had before. Glory with the Father. Okay? All right, with that in mind, let's our last 4 minutes together here. He moves on to the whole topic of authority. Very quickly, I'm going to read verse 31. He said, "If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true." Now, the word true there is the Greek word aleth, which means valid or sufficient. He isn't saying if I testify about myself, my testimony is false. What he's saying, as your outline says, Jesus acknowledges that self-attestation is not enough. It's not enough. If I testify about myself, it's not valid, it's not sufficient. It's not saying it's a lie, it's just not enough. Anybody can testify about themselves. So he provides a list of supporting witnesses. I'm not going to read verses 32 to 47 for time's sake. You can read it, but here's the list on your outline. He has, first of all, 2a, the witness of the Father. He calls on the witness of the Father. 2b, he calls on the witness of John the Baptist. Witness of John the Baptist. 2c, he calls on the witness of his own works, the works of Jesus, his own works. 2d, the witness of the Father is repeated again. Calls on the witness of the Father. So far we have the Father, John the Baptist, his own works, the Father again. 2e, witness of Scripture. 2f, the insufficiency of human recognition. It's not enough what humans say. That doesn't really matter. So he talks about the insufficiency of human recognition. And 2g, the witness of Moses. He even calls upon Moses testifies about me. And if you believe Moses, you would believe me, is what he essentially says. Next week, the feeding of the thousands, the walking on the water, and the bread of life comment. That's all next week.